Hello, welcome to On Wildlife. I'm your host, Alex Ray. On this podcast, we bring the wild to you. We take you on a journey into the life of a different animal every week, and I guarantee you're going to come out of here knowing more about your favorite animal than you did before. This is going to be a really cool episode because I got the chance to interview Dr. Jim Loughry, who has been studying our animal of interest since the 80s and has even published a book on them. So today, we're traveling to the southern United States and South America to talk about a mammal with a shell, the armadillo. So as I said in my introduction, you can find armadillos in Central and South America and in the southern United States. And because they have a pretty slow metabolic rate and don't store a lot of fat on their bodies, they like to live in warmer environments. They also usually live in areas that have sandy or loose soil because they're always digging. And there are around 20 different species of armadillo. The hard outer shell is probably the most prominent feature that armadillos have. And depending on the species, they have a certain number of bands running across their shell. For example, there's a 9-banded armadillo, a 3-banded armadillo, and a 6-banded armadillo. And we're going to talk more about their shells when I talk with Jim. Another characteristic that they have that depends on their species is their size. Armadillos can range from 6 inches, which is the size of the pink fairy armadillo, up to 5 feet long, the size of the giant armadillo. And some species have been known to live for over 30 years. Armadillos have been around for a while, and their relatives were absolutely massive. It's thought that an almost 7-foot, 500-pound armadillo was alive around 10,000 years ago in Florida. Even though they eat mostly insects and larvae, armadillos are considered omnivores because they will eat vegetation at times. And its closest relatives are anteaters, which isn't surprising considering how they eat their food. When they smell their prey underground, they'll start to dig using their claws. And once they've dug deep enough, they use their really long tongue to catch the insects. Their tongue is really sticky, so the insects can't escape. And their tongue has tiny barbs on it, and it's sticky because they have a salivary bladder, which secretes a sticky mucus onto the tongue. Armadillos also have different mating behaviors depending on their species. For example, with the yellow armadillo, the female will actually run away from the males that want to mate with her. Whichever one can catch up to her will be the one that she mates with. And because they're mammals, armadillos give birth to live young. Some species can produce 15 babies at a time, while the 9-banded armadillo almost always has 4 identical offspring. So they're basically having quadruplets every time they reproduce, which is pretty amazing. This is because the 4 offspring all come from one egg, which is called polyembryony. And if you've ever wondered what makes the difference between identical and fraternal twins, it all has to do with the eggs. Identical twins develop from the same egg, while fraternal twins develop from 2 different eggs. Okay, we're going to take a break, but there's a lot more to discuss. So after the break, you're going to hear my interview with Dr. Jim Loughry. Of course, it's trivia time. Here's your question for the day. What does a snail use their radula for? A. Moving. B. Feeling things. C. Seeing. Or D. Eating. The answer is D. Eating. They use the radula to scrape up food particles. Okay, we're back. Here's my interview with Jim. Hey Jim, how are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk about armadillos. I can't wait to get into it.
Happy to be here, and I'll tell you whatever I can tell you, I will tell you.
Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself first and how you became interested in armadillos?
Well, that could be a long story, but I'll keep it I'll keep it short. But actually, I did my PhD work on prairie dogs,
Oh,
which
okay.
would be a good show. Prairie dogs are pretty cool. You ought to think about those. But anyway, when I was in grad school, my now wife, we were not married at the time. She was working on armadillos in South Texas, near Corpus Christi. And I would go there to help her. Then when I graduated and was looking for a job, I finally wound up at Valdosta State here in South Georgia. And I wanted to work on something that was local because, to work on prairie dogs, you have to drive halfway across the country.
Uh-huh.
So I thought, well, maybe armadillos. And it turns out that armadillos were pretty much an empty niche where nobody had done a lot of work, especially not a lot of field work. So it just seemed like a good fit. And so we started to work together on that in the early 1990s, and we've been doing it ever since.
That's awesome. And can you talk a little bit about some of the research that you've done on them?
We wrote a book.
Yeah, I'm sure you could
I don't want to
go.
read the book to you, but it's mostly been behavior and ecology stuff. But
Uh-huh.
it's gone into a lot of different areas. We've done a lot of population genetic work, and I think we probably talk about this later, but armadillos are sort of notorious in the Americas for being the only non-human reservoir for leprosy. And so most recently, we've tried to work on that a little bit. But over the years, it's just been about everything. Just basic habitat selection, time budget. How do they spend their day?
Uh-huh.
They're not active that long because they sleep about 18 hours a day in their burrows. So,
Oh, really?
yeah. So
It must be nice.
but when they're above ground, what do? And turns out mostly all they do is try to find food.
Uh-huh.
They don't do much else. It's just been an attempt to try and fill in a lot of gaps in what we know about their basic biology.
Yeah, that's really important because, like you said, that there hasn't been a lot of research out there done on armadillos. So you guys are doing awesome work.
Well, thank you.
So armadillos are probably known best for their hard outer shell. Can you just explain what that exterior is made out of and what purposes it serves?
Well, it's actually made up of, I guess, two layers, bony plates that are called osteoderms,
Mhm.
that are these little circular structures, and they're adjacent to one another. But then over the top of that is a layer of keratin, which is the same thing as in your fingernail, or in a rhino horn for that matter. And so people tend to think of it like a shell, like a turtle shell. It has nothing in common with a turtle shell. It's more of a leathery covering.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what it's made of. In terms of why it's there, that's a good question. The intuitive, obvious thing is everybody thinks it's to protect them against predators. There's no data that would confirm that.
Really?
For example, at least in the U.S., opossums are about the same size as an armadillo, and there's no data that suggests that armadillos are less vulnerable to predation than opossums because nobody's looked. But you would think that if that was the case, that armadillos ought to be more protected from predators than opossums are, but nobody knows. But there are a couple of other ideas. it's possible armadillos evolved in South America, and they tend to be found in this dry, thorny kind of scrub habitat. So it could be protection against all that thorny vegetation so that they don't get damaged. And then if you look in the fossil record, there are these fossil forms called glyptodonts that use their tails to beat each other up. And the current armadillos do the same thing. They beat each other up as well.
Oh, really?
So carapace could have evolved simply to be a protective covering against attacks from other armadillos. But at this point, these are all possibilities. Nobody knows which is the most likely.
That's really interesting. So do they have, speaking of protection from predators, do they have any natural predators?
Yeah, although it depends on age. A baby armadillo, like most babies, they're vulnerable to lots of things because they're small and stupid, and they can be killed by all kinds of things. But an adult armadillo, I should back up and probably preface this by saying, most of my experiences with the 9-banded armadillos, which are found in the United States.
Okay.
But there are 20 more species of armadillos that are found in Central and South America. And things are different with some of those species. So you can't say that, everything applies to all of these things.
Uh-huh.
But as far as the 9-banded armadillo that I'm most familiar with, for an adult armadillo, the big predators would be things like alligators. Well, in South America, jaguars would be a problem. Probably, at least in the U.S., the biggest predator is probably human beings, because we run over them all the time, and we kill them because they're being pests. But any kind of big dogs can kill an armadillo. There are different kinds of large animals that can manage to kill an adult. The juveniles are more vulnerable to a wider array of things. But generally, if an armadillo can get to be an adult, then it's fairly, I don't want to say invulnerable, but it's pretty secure. It's not like it's living on the edge.
Well, that's good. And I think it's pretty safe to say that a lot of animals' biggest threats are humans, probably. And we could talk about that later too. So also another feature about them is that they have long pointed noses. Do they have a good sense of smell, and do they have any other senses that they rely on?
Well, most armadillos have very poor vision. Certainly the 9-banded armadillos that are in the U.S., they're mostly nocturnal. They have very poor vision, so at best they probably see shadows. So the two senses that they really rely on are hearing and smell. They're pretty sensitive to sound. If you're trying to catch an armadillo and you make noise, it's just going to run off. And if you're upwind of one and it smells you, it's going to run off as well. So those are probably the two senses they rely on the most. But the length of the nose doesn't have as much to do with that as how they feed, I think.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. So can you talk a little bit about how they dig their burrows? Because they spend most of their time there.
They do. It varies by species, but typically they spend For example, with nine-banded armadillos, the average is they spend about 18 hours a day in their burrow and only 6 hours above ground looking for food. So the burrow is an important thing. And they do dig them, although there again, it gets into the same issue with diversity, that there are some species in South America that really don't dig burrows, or if they do dig them, it's just this little shallow pit,
Hmm.
and then they spend the night there or the day there, whichever it happens to be for their activity rhythm. And then they go and dig another one the next day. With the nine-banded armadillos that we have in the U.S., they dig more extensive burrows. When I say extensive, it's not that elaborate. They dig a shallow tunnel that extends down a few feet or so, and then they have an enlarged area where they have a nest. They collect grass and dried leaves, and they create a nest. And sometimes there'll be a passage off the back of that. And if they get disturbed, like for example, we've tried to catch armadillos that were in a burrow by trying to pull them out.
Uh-huh.
And if we couldn't do that, they would go down that back passageway and actually dig themselves up to the surface a few feet away. And sometimes we would be clever enough to see that they were doing that and catch them. Sometimes, all armadillos evolved in South America, mostly in the tropics. And so they're adapted to a fairly hot climate. And so if you have armadillos like the ones we have in the US, where you get into seasons of the year where it's not as warm, then you have to have a means of adapting to that. And I guess getting back, you had asked about the carapace before and what it's made of, but one of the other things about the carapace is that and this is kind of technical physiological stuff, but it has what's called high thermal conductance. So what all that means is it releases heat really well. So armadillos are adapted to release heat. Conserving heat is not something they do. And they have a really low metabolic rate, much lower than most mammals of their body size. So it seems like, that if you look at their ecological lifestyle, they're adapted to live in these warm habitats where conserving heat is not usually an issue.
Uh-huh.
That what you want to do is release heat, but they're not. The burrows are not about keeping them extremely. It's not like a hibernating mammal where they dig down really deep and keep themselves really warm. It's just about being able to keep slightly warmer than the surrounding environment.
That's cool that they have that strategy to stay warm when their bodies are pretty much or pretty much built to release heat instead of keep it in. So that's really cool. So a lot of animals that burrow usually burrow with other individuals. Are armadillos solitary, or are they more social animals?
No, almost. In fact, I cannot think of a species that is social. They're largely solitary, except during the breeding season. But even there, it's fairly minimal. And then you'll have, after a female gives birth, she'll share the burrow with her offspring for a variable amount of time, typically maybe a couple of months. They're largely in there. In fact, even when a female gives birth and has a litter, at least with the nine-banded armadillos in the United States, a lot of times once the young are weaned, so they're sort of semi-independent, they'll come up earlier in the day and start to forage while the mother is still in the burrow. So there's not a lot of interaction there. If you wanted to study social behavior, armadillos would be a terrible choice. there's not a lot going on there.
That's cool. And so have you done any research into how smart they are compared to other mammals? Or
I don't know. The conventional wisdom is that armadillos are dumb. And there may be some truth to that. But the flip side of that is that they're still here for millions of years. So apparently they're smart enough to do what they got to do. And it's true for any species that, animals have evolved to be able to solve the problems that they are confronted with. But anyway, I guess to get back to your original question, no, we have not done anything to try and test their intelligence. I'm not even sure how we would do that.
Yeah, I can imagine that's not an easy task. And you know what? No matter how dumb they are, they're well adapted to their environment. So that's what matters.
Well, every animal is, or it wouldn't be here, right?
Exactly.
So they do what they have to do.
Yep. And speaking of them being in an ecosystem, what role do armadillos play in their ecosystem?
Well, there again, it sort of depends on the species. But people have made the case recently that they are ecosystem engineers because their burrowing has impacts on soil dynamics. And the burrows themselves, you asked about the burrows earlier. The burrows are used by an incredible number of species. So the burrows are used by all kinds of other species. And so that's a big impact. Armadillos, generally speaking, eat a lot of insects, beetles, ants, those kinds of things. And so they play a role in regulating or controlling those kinds of species in the habitat. So they have a substantial impact on the habitats that they occur in. Mm-hmm. And so whether they're the most important or not, that's how do you decide that? But
yeah.
but they're very impactful on the systems that they're found in.
That's really cool. And so a lot of animals rely on them and their burrows to survive, which is really pretty cool. So kind of going off of that question, what are some of the challenges that armadillos are facing right now?
Well, it's mostly, again, in South America with the other species. The nine-banded armadillos in the U.S., they get persecuted as pests, but beyond that, there's not a whole lot that seems to be a problem. But in South America, Central America, the two biggest issues that, when you talk about any of those species, the first two things you always hear about are habitat destruction, where you have land that's being converted into agriculture, you have fragmentation of the habitats, those kinds of things. And then the other big one is human impacts. Mm-hmm. Armadillos are hunted for food in a lot of Latin America, especially not surprisingly, the bigger species, like a giant armadillo. That's a lot of food for somebody. So those are prized items. And so there's that. There's wildlife trade, which you wouldn't think would be a big deal, but apparently some people want to keep these things as pets for who knows what reason. And so those are the two big things. Everything, it all relates back to what we're doing to them, but it's either what we're doing to their habitats or what we're doing to them directly.
Absolutely. And it's sad that we're kind of destroying their habitats, and I don't know why people are trying to get these animals as pets. That doesn't make much sense. They're not meant to be pets.
It's a mystery to me. The pet thing, I don't get, because they're terrible. They're not social. There's no point in having an armadillo as a pet.
Absolutely.
So anybody watching this, don't do that. It's stupid. Please.
Number one thing to take away: don't have an armadillo.
If you get nothing else out of this, don't get an armadillo as a pet. Please.
And this is going to be my last question. So, is there anything that the average person can do to help armadillos?
I would say two things. For the 9-banded armadillos that are in the United States, the best thing you can do is just leave them alone. Leave them be. They are a reservoir for leprosy, so messing with them is not a good idea for that reason. But they're doing well. They don't need a lot of intervention from human beings. Just let them be. But now, when we talk about the other 20-some species that are in Latin America, they need more help. And so I will make a plug here. I think you know about this because you found me through it. But if you wanted to help armadillos in general, not just the 9-banded armadillos in the U.S., you should go to the IUCN's Anteater, Sloth, and Armadillos Specialist Group webpage, which that's a mouthful. So I printed it out so you can do this. Go there.
Okay, great. I'll read it off right now. Okay, it's XENARTHRANS.org.
And they have all the information you would need but to help these other species, you should go through the specialist group website because they know they have the best means of being able to make something happen.
Absolutely. Everybody should go check that out. And Jim,
they should. It's actually a good website.
Yeah. And Jim, thank you so much for coming on, talking all about armadillos. I learned so much. And just thanks for answering all my questions.
Oh, happy to do it. No problem.
I'm so glad that Jim was able to talk with us about armadillos, and I hope you all learned as much as I did. Although armadillos aren't endangered, some species are vulnerable, and they definitely face a lot of challenges. If you want to help out armadillos, here are a few organizations that are doing great work to support their conservation. The Pittsburgh Zoo is assisting with a project called the Giant Armadillo Conservation Project. There's also the National Wildlife Federation and the World Animal Foundation. Thank you so much for coming on this adventure with me as we explored the world of the armadillo. You can find the sources that we used for this podcast and links to organizations that we reference at www.onwildlife.org. Don't forget to tune in next Wednesday to learn about a new animal. And that's On Wildlife.
listening to On Wildlife with Alex Ray, brought to you every Wednesday.